What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Speedy's Garage YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be working on a little project that probably should have done a while back, but I'm always a little leery of making GoManGo too much like a race car, and I drive it on the street a ton, so I didn't want to, you know, make it vibrate or make a bunch of more noise or anything like that. But I'm getting to the point where at the track I think I'm going to need a little something extra. I'm putting down a little bit more power now. I've got the AAD drag pack suspension, which helped a lot. If you didn't see that, I'll link to the top when we put that in, me and Crew Chief Greg. Today I'm going to add an additional enhancement that should work and kind of go along with the AAD drag pack suspension. I'm hoping it doesn't change the driving characteristics of the car because, like I said, it's mainly a street car that I just take to the track occasionally. Probably 98% of the time I'm out riding around on the street enjoying just driving the car. So the last thing I want to do is make it vibrate or noisy or anything like that. I really like the way it rides, so I'm hesitant to really screw with the suspension too much because I hear from, you know, various people they did this or they did that, and it ended up having a few side effects that they probably didn't count on. But we're going to get after a little something today. I've already got it up on jack stands. I did that yesterday. Honestly, getting it up on the stands is kind of a, you know, pain in the butt. So I usually do that ahead of any projects just to save some time. I'm gonna show you what I got. It has been really hot and rainy here lately, so the shop AC has been working overtime. Definitely a good investment. I sure don't miss the days of having to be in the hot garage with stuff everywhere and tripping over tools and things on the floor. And I took a little vacation, so I've been gone for about a week, but the supercharger is rebuilt and on its way back to me from SDG Motorsports. So I've got everything laid out. Ready to reassemble that. I expect it'll be here in just a couple of days. He actually turned it around really quickly. I was surprised how quickly he emailed me back and said, hey, it's ready to go. I was getting ready to go out of town, so I asked him to just hang on to it for an additional week so that I had time to obviously get back. I didn't want the supercharger sitting in front of the shop while we were out of town. So it's on its way back. That'll be the next project, is reassembling that. And then I'll probably won't install it till after the racing season. I've got the car set up to run the times that I want it to run and the class that I like to race in, and I'll have to do some experimentation and some retuning and stuff when the new supercharger goes on. So we're going to hold off on that. But today, I'll show you a couple of things I got. This I bid on at Challenger Fest and won, and these are some of these Durlin lift blocks. They replace the kind of flimsy plastic ones that are factory, real simple 1 bolt. I've had them for a little while, just now getting around to putting them on. This is the main thing that I've had on the workbench for a little while, just waiting for a rainy weekend to install, and I'll show you that. Finally going to do the cradle lockout. Went with the BMR. Let's see what we got here. Actually, I think it's this way. Hard to do this one-handed. Beefy. Well, here's what you get. You get these aluminum machined plates. This is for the rear, bottom, and then a ring that goes in the top. This is for the front, same kind of deal, a bottom support with a ring that goes in the top. And the idea is that these sandwich the bushing and firm up the rear end so it doesn't wiggle around as much, especially like when you're launching the car at the drag strip. These have been around a while, so if you're familiar with these cars, you're probably already familiar with this stuff. To get the job done, I'm going to be using obviously pretty heavy-duty electric impact. The 18mm bolts that hold the cradle are torqued to 124 foot-pounds. We're going to need a torque wrench. I'm going to be using my electric ratchet, 10mm socket, a 16 for the shocks, 18 for those cradle bolts, and then you need a 21 to get the wheels off. I'll be putting these on as part of the project. You get a card that takes you to some installation instructions from BMR, but I'll be honest, I looked at those instructions and I think they're going way overboard. I have dropped this cradle before to install those AAD arms and it wasn't that big of a deal. For some reason, they've got you disconnecting like a difficult part of the brake system, removing the gasoline fill tube from the gas tank, which means draining the tank. I'm not going to do any of that. I didn't have to do that before. I'm going to try to do this with like minimal parts being removed. And the plan of attack will be to do one side at a time. And so I'm hoping I can just loosen these 4 bolts up, you know, 2 on each side, and drop that cradle down enough just to get that top ring in there. That's really why you're having to do that, is to get that ring on top of the bushing. That's a plan of attack. We're going to see how we do. And you're obviously going to need a jack, not only to raise the car up, but that's also how I'm going to control how far the cradle gets lowered. You're going to need some jack stands, and be super careful where you place the jack stands. Make sure the car is really well secured, because you're going to be working a pretty heavy part of the suspension, and so you want to make sure it's really well secured so it doesn't, you don't have any mishaps, we'll call them. All right, to get started, there's a plastic shield down here. I'm not sure if I'm going to have to take it all the way off or not, but I am going to disconnect it in a couple of places. You can see this lower control arm here. As I lower the cradle, I want to give that some room. I'm not going to lower the cradle much, but it's probably going to be enough that I need to pull these out and give the cradle a little room to move. So I'm just going to see how much I have to take apart. That should be plenty. And I put a track alignment on the car, and I got a lifetime alignment, but I want to try to avoid having to go back up and having it checked. So what I've done is made a couple of witness marks or indexing marks on the cradle and the body, and I figure if I can line those up, and I did some on the back side and some on the, I guess, horizontal and vertical, I don't know what you would call that, east and west, so that if I can line those up in an X, and I did it at each bushing, if I can line those up or get them very, very close, the alignment should still be good to go afterwards. And next I'm going to do the 2 16mm bolts that hold this shock in, and this 10mm bolt that holds the brake line. That should give me enough wiggle room, and I'm going to use a wobbly socket to get in here because the space is a little tight. I've done the same thing on the other side of the car. I got the plastic panel loosened, I've got the brake line loosened, and on the shock I just loosened the bolts. There is a long threaded part that goes up through the top of that shock, and what I don't want to have happen is as I'm moving the cradle around, I don't want that to pop out on this side and come back and hit my fender or scratch it up or something. So I just left the bolts loose, and now my idea is just to loosen this side, which is, this is going to be the passenger side. It doesn't really matter which one you start with, but my idea is to just loosen these cradle bolts and then remove the 2 on the other side, and that should let the cradle fall. I am going to go ahead and take off the rearmost hangers of the exhaust. I think they're 13mm, just so the exhaust can hang down and give a little bit of room there, and then we're going to get to work on those cradle bolts. I'm pretty sure I got everything out of the way. It's going to let the cradle drop. So now I'm actually going to work on the driver's side first. So I'm going to start on the passenger side and just loosen the cradle bolts so that the cradle can just move a little bit. They're 18mm. That should be good. Now we'll do the front one. And I do have a jack under the differential, so just in case. I'm back on the driver's side, and I'm going to start with this front cradle bolt. There's a limiter on here. Not all cars got them, I don't think, but mine has them. And I'm going to try to use a pry bar and pry that off. It's a press fit deal. If it won't come off easily, the option is to drill, or the solution is to sort of drill into the side of it here, and I've got a cobalt bolt or a cobalt drill bit from pinning the crank that'll make easy work of that, I hope, if I have to drill it. But I'm gonna take the bolt out and see if I can just get a pry bar here and pry that out. I'm gonna start with that one before I even start messing with the back one. see how tough this dude is. Got a pretty good sized pry bar here. Yeah, it's not moving. I mean, I could probably really crank down on it and get it off of there, but I'm afraid it's gonna end up damaging something if I just pry on it too hard. So I'm gonna cut through the side of that limiter. Got a punch I'm gonna use to get a starting point so my drill bit doesn't walk around. Be good. And this is a Cobalt drill bit from Milwaukee. It worked really well on the crank, so I figure it should work just as good on this. Oh yeah, it's cutting good. There's what the drilling looks like. A little bit of a pain in the butt. You're definitely gonna need a Cobalt bit. That's some pretty hard steel. Now I'm gonna try to pry it off and hope it's good enough. It's moving. There we go. Woo! Glad I ate my Wheaties. There it is. That's the limiting plate. You can see how the drill bit went through there. Definitely gotta have the Cobalt like I said. I had better luck prying down than I did trying to leverage and pry up. So on the other side, I may try prying down first before I go through the trouble of drilling it, but honestly, it took about 5 minutes to drill that out, not a big deal. And this thing, jump. Next, I need to use a razor and cut the rest of this, or cut this rubber buffer off of this bushing. I'm gonna cut it as flush to the metal as I can. So you can see I trimmed all that rubber flush with the base. And I went ahead and vacuumed everything up. I don't want to be laying in all that crap, metal shavings and rubber shavings. And now the smaller rings go in the front, and the bottom one is going to fit like that. And then we'll have to drop the cradle a little bit to get the top ring in. So I'm going to go ahead and take that rear bolt out and start working on those. And I've still got the jack underneath the differential. Obviously the other side bolts are still in, they're just loose. But I'm gonna go slow with this because I don't want it moving too much or unexpectedly. Okay. All right, so here's what you end up with. You end up with a kind of big washer. This goes away in the rear, and it gets replaced with this guy. So that's the rear. I'll set them aside, and the ring will go on top. And I'm gonna have to lower the jack just a little bit because I don't have enough room to get those rings in the top. So I'm gonna try to do that. That thing's moving too quickly. Keep an eye on everything. I only need a couple of inches. See how that looks. I'm putting a rag over this shock so that it doesn't do anything crazy. Can I reach anything now? I can reach the back one. I can reach the front one. So yeah, we're good to go. We can put these in now. I'm gonna start in the back and just set the ring in. It's flat on both sides. So it just gets squished down into the bushing, and make sure you push it in there. That's good. Do the same thing on the front, and this one's rounded a little bit on one side and flat on the other. So I'm gonna put the rounded end into the bushing. That one's a little tight. I'm gonna put some WD-40 on that to help it go in a little easier. All right, put a little WD-40 on it. I have to use a little leverage to get the sucker set in there. There we go. Okay, I got both tops spacers in, or lockouts. Now I'm going to jack the cradle back up. Be aware of this shock. It'll kind of want to not go back where it's supposed to, so I'm going to kind of have to deal with that a little bit as I jack it up. So that's going to be just a little bit tricky. I ended up having to put a bungee cord around this shock. It kept wanting to lean out and the top wouldn't go back in the shock hole there. So I got a bungee cord around it, holding it in place. I've raised the cradle up enough where I can get the bolts started. I'm gonna run those up. And I'm gonna sort of check preliminary alignment and kind of see how it looks, and then get on to the other side. All right, so I got the 18mm cradle bolts just in, not tight. I did go ahead and start the shock bolt, so this shock isn't bouncing around all over the place. And I can take off the bungee cord I used, get rid of that. And then I just have to go and do the exact same process on the other side. Okay, I got everything wrapped up on the other side. Now I'm just tightening up the 18mm cradle bolts to 124 foot-pounds. It's quite a bit, so if it looks like I'm breaking a sweat, it's because I am. I've done 3 of them. Get this last one. There we go. Now I'm going to retighten the shock bolts and put the exhaust hangers back in place. Put the skid plates on. We're pretty much done. If you put a jack under the brake rotor and just gently lift the shock into place, you can use the bolts as guides. It'll help you when you're tightening them back up. And the torque spec on those is 46 foot-pounds. Here they are installed, all wrapped up. Hopefully you remember where all the plastic pins went if you took yours off. Not too hard. A couple here, one up there. So there it is, project complete. Well, it's all wrapped up. I'll scale 1 to 10. I'd probably get a 5 or a 6 doing it by yourself on jack stands. If you had a buddy that could come over and help you, it'd probably be like a 4, because they could keep an eye on the shocks and stuff and make sure they don't flip out. You don't want the shocks to fall out and scratch up your fender. So I had to use bungee cords to hold them in place. You know, I tied them to the coil springs, so they'll want to fall out when you start to lower the cradle. And the indexing marks, I highly recommend you do that on the cradle and the body, so that you know everything's lined back up. I did have to put a pry bar in here and sort of pry back on the cradle a little bit to line everything back up. It was easy. It was only off by 1/4 of an inch, but got a pry bar in there, pulled back in a little bit, got those indexing marks to line back up, and I know everything's good to go. Let's see, it took me about 3 hours, but I always take my time when I'm working on the car. I'm out here to enjoy myself, number 1, and number 2, I make mistakes if I rush. So I don't get into a rush when I'm working on one of these. And it took me 3 hours, but I'm also filming, so that probably added an hour. I probably could have done it in 2 if I'd just been going at it. Everything was pretty easy, to be honest. The pain in the butt parts were really getting those limiting plates off. I tried just prying them off. A friend of mine did that with his and had no trouble. I pried on these pretty hard and they didn't seem like they were gonna come off. A cobalt bit is what you're gonna have to drill through the side if yours don't wanna come off very easily, and then they pop right off like you saw. And then cutting that rubber bushing off, that was kind of a pain. You saw the knife I used, it was some of the short blade utility knife. I would probably go back and get one of the long fixed blades. Don't get the one that breaks off. You know, you get the tip worn out, you break a piece off and you got a new, kind of a new blade. You'll need one that's solid, but about 3 or 4 inches long. It would have made easier work of that, but I was able to get it done with that utility knife that I used. Everything else was relatively easy. And the weather is crap today, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to take the car out for a drive and kind of give driving impressions after installing the cradle lockout. One of the reasons I've been putting this off is, like I said, I drive this car on the street primarily, and I didn't want to create any more vibration or noise or anything like that. These have been out for a while, and a bunch of people have them installed, and everybody I talked to said they can't even tell they're on there until they go to the drag strip, and they can tell they get a more consistent 60 foot because everything's kind of locked in. And I checked with Mike at OST Dyno too, and he knows how I like to enjoy the car, and he said you'd probably be fine with this. He doesn't recommend I go any farther, so this is probably going to be it for me as far as suspension goes. I got the AED drag pack set up with all the arms. I've got the drag, what I call a drag race alignment, where it's almost, you know, zero camber, zero toe, so everything's nice and square and flat. And now I got the cradle lockout, so that's probably about the max I'm going to do. Be sure to tune back in. I will tell you what I find when I drive the car. I drive it a lot, so I'll be able to tell if there's any major differences. So I will do a little bit of content on that just as a follow-up. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at Speedies_garage, as well as our website, www.speediesgarage.net. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hopefully I'll see you out there.